Propagating vegetable plants is possibly the stage of the growing process that has the greatest diversity of different options of methods and equipment that can be used. I've tried a lot of different methods for starting my vegetable plants, including using big trays of modules, growing in individual pots, transplanting bare-rooted plants from a flat of soil or a dedicated seedbed in the garden, direct sowing, and I've even tried using toilet paper rolls. A few years ago, I decided to buy a soil blocker, which I had been intrigued about for quite a while as it seemed such an odd and interesting idea to simply compress blocks of soil. It turns out that I quite like using this method, and it seems to fit the scale of the growing that I'm doing, and I've adapted to using soil blocks for quite a bit of the plant propagation for my gardens. The reasons that I like using soil blocks are essentially the same reasons for why this tool was developed and how it's being promoted. I like the fact that it has allowed me to significantly reduce the diversity and number of plastic trays and pots that I would otherwise need to use in my gardens, but it hasn't eliminated plastic altogether, not yet at least. If done properly, the plants are definitely less root bound when growing in soil blocks than they typically get when they're grown in pots or modules or other containers. In a lot of ways, they're easier to manage and to transplant if done properly, and they're quite adaptable, as I can produce and use as many blocks as I need, rather than having to fill an entire tray with a lot of seedlings that I wouldn't use, or to have a half-empty tray taking up a lot of space. Soil blocks are a fairly simple concept and process, where you use a tool to press a growing medium or compost into blocks, and then the seeds are planted directly into the top of that block. A lot depends on the nature and characteristics of the growing medium or potting compost that is being used. It apparently needs to be quite fibrous in order to hold the block together, firm enough so that it doesn't fall apart when moved around, but still open enough internally for the roots to be able to penetrate and easily grow to fill the entire block. I was initially worried that these blocks would be too firm and that they would restrict the growth of roots, but it doesn't seem to be a problem, at least not with the prepared mix that I'm currently using. The blocks are made by pushing the blocker down into the growing medium to pack each of the 4 molds of this tool, and then the lever is squeezed to push the blocks out. The set of 4 blocks can be placed on a tray, board, or any other kind of surface, and quite a few of them can be made in a relatively short period of time, even with a small version of this tool. Little plastic dimples in the top of the mold create an indentation in the soil block that seeds can be planted directly into, and then they can be managed and cared for in ways similar to most other forms of propagation. It is fascinating and a little bit unnerving to see the roots grow to the surface of the side of the block, and then to either stop or to start to grow down the outside of the soil block. A lot of types of plants don't seem to mind their roots exposed like this, so long as they are reasonably sheltered and kept moist, of course. When it's time to transplant them into the garden or to pot them up into larger containers, I simply pick up the block and drop it into the soil. I think the thing that impressed me most was how well these soil blocks stayed together most of the time. I find that making soil blocks is a fairly straightforward and simple thing to do, but as with anything, there are a few techniques and conditions that make things a lot easier. Getting the right amount of water into the mix before making the blocks really helps, and it seems to work best when the growing medium is much wetter than I would have expected. It needs to be wet enough to allow the material to press or flow easily into the mold of the tool, like a soft clay, but without being so wet that the material falls out again. Once made, I found that I could simply drop the seed or numerous seeds into the little indentation in the top of the block, and then depress them lightly into the block with the top of a pencil so that they are in direct contact with the growing medium. It seems that most of the time the seeds don't need to be covered with anything else, but some types of seedlings seem to benefit from having a bit of weight of soil on top of them so that they can root properly. But this may be due to how much the growing medium was compressed when the blocks were originally made. Watering these blocks is possibly the most critical issue and can be a bit tricky as the water can so easily flow through the spaces between the blocks. Like all methods of propagation, frequent watering really helps, but once these blocks dry out, they can be really difficult to wet again. This is something I've struggled with at times, and I found that floating the flats in a big tank of water was the best way to ensure that they were fully watered, right through to the center of the block. The first season that I started making these soil blocks, I used a range of different types of plastic trays that I had hanging around in order to place the blocks into. But then I built a number of different sized flats or trays out of scrap wood, and I designed them so that the blocks were fairly close together, that the space between the blocks was quite small. I did this mainly out of a concern to reduce the amount of water evaporation off of the sides of the soil blocks, but it ended up increasing the likelihood of the roots of one of the plants in one block jumping the gap into the adjacent block. This undermined the whole benefit of the roots being air-pruned, and it did mean that there was occasionally some significant root damage when I had to pull the blocks apart in order to transplant them. I also found that having a closed or flat bottom to the tray meant that the plants sometimes formed a continuous mat of roots at the base of the blocks. This may have helped the seedlings to grow quickly, but caused problems and substantial root damage when it came time for transplanting. I've recently shifted to using open bottom plastic trays for a lot of the soil blocks, and intentionally spacing them farther apart. This meant that the regular watering became much more critical, but generally ensures that the roots are pruned at the surface of each individual block, which is what I want. With these plastic trays, I found that the best way to water the blocks was simply to place the whole tray into another tray lined with plastic and filled with water, which ensures that the whole block becomes wet. It does take time to allow the water to soak into the blocks compared to a quick watering with a watering can, but it is much more effective. Another interesting aspect of the soil block method is that I can get another tool to create microblocks for sowing many plants in a very small space. These smaller blocks can then be transplanted into the normal sized blocks once the seedlings have established. These microblocks are great for starting seeds that are really slow to germinate, or when sowing older seeds that have a very low germination rate. They really do allow seedlings to be started in a very small space, but with such a small amount of soil, they dry out very quickly and need to be soaked at least once a day, if not more. The little plastic dimple in the top of the standard soil block can be replaced by an insert that is specifically sized to receive the microblock, which is really handy. But while they do save space, they also add another step in the process of propagation, which increases the amount of time and effort that I need to put in, compared to just sowing into the larger blocks in the first place. And I need to be careful about timing to make sure that I transplant these microblocks into the regular sized blocks before the seedling roots grow too much. I've also found that the larger inserts make it more difficult to get the soil blocks out of the tool without damaging them. I suspect it has something to do with the amount of water in the growing medium and the amount of surface tension or suction within the tool when using these larger inserts. But these are a few issues that I hope to figure out as I become more experienced with using this variation of the soil block method. Up until now, I've been using a pre-prepared mix or growing medium which I buy in order to make these blocks. And now that I'm more comfortable using this technique, I'd like to start to make my own mix, which would involve experimenting with different proportions of various types of materials that I can get my hands on in order to figure out which works best. I'd like to try out a larger version of the soil blocker, which produces many more blocks at one time, in order to increase the efficiency of this stage of the propagation process. And it would be really interesting to experiment with making much larger blocks so that I can continue to transplant larger plants like tomatoes rather than having to pot them up into plastic pots. For the diversity of gardens that I have, this tool makes it much easier to propagate just the number of plants that I need, and it seems to be really appropriate technology for the scales that I'm operating at. While I still use some other methods of propagation for different contexts and situations, I'm quite content to use the soil blocks as the main form of propagation for most of the plants in my gardens, and to adapt to the constraints and benefits of this tool. Well, spring is finally here, and there's lots of seeds to sow and garden beds to prepare, and I'm already working on more videos for the near future. If you're new to my channel and like the quality of my videos and are interested in seeing more, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe. And if you'd like to support my Red Gardens project and this YouTube channel even more, I have links to Patreon and PayPal in the description below. But most importantly, thank you for watching.